Module 2, Referential Pragmatics. 2.1 Introduction. Leach 1983-11 briefly mentions the label for the area that we will discuss in this module, namely referential pragmatics. He defined it as the assignment of reference to referential expressions in a given utterance. EDID. The notion of reference briefly popped up in the previous module. Let us explore the area through an example. Consider this statement. 2.1 The Palgrave editor visited me in my office today. The Palgrave editor is who exactly? There are several such editors who work for the publisher Palgrave, and there have been many such editors. Which one are we talking about? This is a referring expression directing the reader to pick out a specific person from the context. Similarly, my office is directing the reader to pick out a particular place. Again, the reader will have to work out which office is being talked about. What of me and my? Clearly, they refer to the author of this statement, and it's up to the reader to work out who that author is. Similarly, today refers to the time period in which the author was writing, and we will need to work out when that is. All these expressions involve working out connection with context. They are referring expression. In a very general sense, all expression used in relation to something out there in the world, a world which includes the discourses we create, can be said to involve reference to something. Reference, broadly conceived, is a topic of special interest in semantics and philosophy. This kind of very general relation is not our focus here. For more on this, see Frigg's classic 1892-1952 work on sense and reference. We are interested in expressions, such as those in our example, whose meaning will seem inadequate without the interpreter having made a connection with the specific part of a specific context, a referent. The fact that those expressions involve a referent, an entity to which they refer, means that all referring expressions presuppose the existence of an entity. We will use the term referring to denote the narrower, more dynamic, indeed, pragmatic usage of expression that connect with context, both drawing meaning from it and shaping it. Note that referring expression do not in themselves refers to entities, but are used and interpreted by participants as doing so. That is what makes them pragmatic. One key issue when considering referring expression is, naturally, what specific aspect of context the speaker is referring to. In pragmatics, there are at least 3 dimensions involved in referring. Consider, for instance, the following excerpt from the film, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, which starts when Charles attempts to introduce himself to another guest at the wedding. Charles: How do you do? My name is Charles. Guest: Don't be ridiculous. Charles died 20 years ago. Charles: Must be a different Charles, I think. Guest: Are you telling me I don't know my own brother? Charles: No. For Wedding and a Funeral, 1994. Director, Mike Newell. Writer, Richard Curtis. We can identify at least 3 different forms of referring going on in this rather confused interaction. First, we have both Charles and the guest referring to themselves and the other through various pronouns, including I and you. This involves pointing to a specific referent in the extra-linguistic context, and most importantly, indicating how this referent relates to some point of reference, here the speaker. This is traditionally termed deixis. Second, there is some confusion on the guest part at least, as to whether Charles, when saying my name is Charles, refers to a person the guest already knows, or one he is getting to know at the very moment, or what we might term epistemic aspect of context. In this case, the speakers are referring to Hear different assumption about who they think the other person has in mind. When the speaker assumes that the hearer knows the specific referent in mind, this comes under scope of definiteness. While when the speaker doesn't make such an assumption, it is a matter of indefiniteness. The crux of the guest's confusion here is the guest has his brother in the mind when Charles is referred to, and consequently thinks that Charles does as well. Third, some expressions they use are used to refer back to things they have said earlier. For instance, when the guest utters my own brother, he is referring back to his previous reference to Charles, who died 20 years ago. Instances where speakers are referring back to what has been earlier referred to in previous talk, or what might be termed linguistic aspect of context or context, comes under the scope of anaphora. In this module, we will explaining in more detail the pragmatics of these three forms of referring. Supplying a list of English referring expression is not straightforward. However, as debates rage over where to draw the line with respect to what is referring and what is not. Let us first briefly consider the extremes. All scholars would agree that verbs and prepositions are not referring expressions. Consider our example 2.1 above. The verb visited and the preposition in were the only items we did not claim to be referring expressions. To understand them, you do not need to pick out a specific visit or a specific spatial relation with respect to the office. We ignore here the fact that visited carries a past tense marker. The other extreme is more controversial. Many, if not all, scholars would agree that the demonstrative, this is a referring expression of some kind. But there are other possible candidates for referring expressions too. Table 2.1 lists English referring expressions that are thought to be so by many scholars. In broad terms, the categories of Table 2.1 are ordered from those whose meaning is more descriptive, more encoded in the abstract sense of the expression, to those whose meaning is more contextual, more dependent on a relationship with a specific contextual aspect. The former is more semantic and the latter more pragmatic. The book, a definite expression, has some descriptive meaning in the abstract, as the noun book denotes the concept of a book, although we do not know which particular book is being referred to. This, a deictic expression, has very little descriptive meaning in the abstract, although we may suppose that it concerns something relatively close in some way to the speaking voice. Compare with that. The organization of this module is based on this table. First, we attend to the extremes of the table, definite expression followed by deictic expressions, and then anaphoric expression in the middle. In the final section, we take a more interactional view of how referring expressions are used and understood. Table 2.1 Categories of English Referring Expressions. Category: Definite Expressions. Definite noun phrase. Example: the book's Jonathan course may example, etc. More semantic. Proper nouns. Sample: Michael Smith, Professor Leach, etc. Category: anaphoric expressions. Example: he, it, they, herself, etc. More pragmatic. Category: deictic expressions. Example: this, that, I, here, now, tomorrow, etc. More pragmatic. 2.2 Definite expressions. Definite expressions encode some semantic meaning in their nominal elements. For example, as mentioned above, book in the definite expression, the book relates to whatever mental representation you have for the concept of a book. Moreover, Frege noted that the definite expression not only denotes something but also implies that it exists. We will pick up on this in our discussion of presupposition in section 3.2.2. Russell, 1905. however, argue that the key issue with expressions such as the book is not just that they imply existence, but that generally they indicated uniqueness, a particular book in our example. For Russell, definite expressions do not refer directly to something. It is simply a matter of finding a true match between the semantic descriptive content of the expression and any candidates for a match in the world. Others, such as Strawson 1950, argue from a more pragmatic perspective that it all depends on the use of the expression in context. For example, the semantic of the book in a decontextualized sentences such as pass the book may signal that a unique book is involved. But you are unlikely to know exactly which book is being referred to. In contrast, if somebody arrived in the room where you are right now and said the same to you, you may be led into thinking not only that a unique book is involved, but also that they refer to the very book you are now reading. And if they arrive when you were reading in bed, you might think that they refer to your bedtime novel. A starting point is to say that definite expressions are primarily used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific context which is assumed to be shared by the interlocutors. We air this issue further below, especially in section 2.5. There are various ways in which language can signal definiteness. The paradigm method in English is the definite article, the most frequent word in written and spoken English. Leach et al. 2001, 181 and 144. Like other noun phrase determiners such as possessive determiner pronoun. Example: my, your, our, their, book, demonstratives. Some example: this, that, book, or s genitives. Example: Jonathan's book, definite articles, determine. The definiteness of the noun phrase compare the sentence in 2.3. 2.3. A. The book you're reading is great. B. A book you're reading is great. You are likely to interpret A as referring to the book you are currently reading. Apologize for the immodesty. But with B, it could be about any book you are currently reading. This book, other course books, the novel you read when you go to bed, etc. B contains the indefinite article A, contrasting with the definite article the, apart from noun phrase with determiners, pronouns. Example: I, you, she, it can express definiteness in English, as can proper noun, a topic we will discuss below. Reflection: the development of the in English. The earliest stages of English had no definite article, nor did it have a contrasting indefinite article. Speakers and writers in Old English, approximately 500 to 1,100, deployed the demonstrative form se, from which this seems to have developed. For some of the function undertaken by today's the, se is the nominative masculine form of demonstrative and many not ring any present-day demonstrative bells. But the nominative and accusative neuter form is the first letter of this word represent the sound later represented by th, from which, as it plain to see, is derived the present-day demonstrative that. Example: pass me that sandwich, please. Let us look at an example demonstrative are underlined. 2.4. Here Oswald, the, that, blessed Archbishop, gave up this life and reached that heavenly life. An alderman, nobleman, Edelwine departed this life in that same year. As one can see from the present-day translation, there are 2 points where the Old English demonstrative can be rendered by either present-day, the, or that. Both signal definiteness, that is, they invite participant to identify a particular entity. Example: a particular archbishop, a particular year. Today, the difference between the and that in this context is that, unlike the, is used to focus the target attention on something. But in Old English, this use is not so clear. Incidentally, the other instances of that in that heavenly life is not the same. In this case, it involves a deictic contrast with the previous demonstrative. This such that the referent move from the relatively close state of this life to the relatively far away state of that heavenly life. We will discuss deictic matters more fully in section 2.3. But the point to note here is that the Old English demonstrative SE, along with its various forms, was deployed in a range of functions, including those for which we would regularly use the word the today. Over time, then, a demonstrative form has developed into the definite article the English language has today. Note with particular reference to Table 2.1. It has moved from the relatively contextual, extralinguistic category of deictic expression to the relatively abstract, linguistic category of definite expressions, in other words, from more pragmatic to less. English is not alone in the way. Its definite article developed. Definite articles in Romance language, example, French, Italian, Spanish, such as le, il, el, lo, la, have developed from the Latin. Demonstrative, masculine, feminine. Although there are complexities for specific dialects of these languages. Klein Andrew, 1996. Although the categories in Table 2.1 do not always represent continuous links in a chain, if a particular item develops functions outside its initial category, they are usually functions that belong to a less contextually determined category. They rely less on a specific context for a particular meaning and instead have the same meaning for a range of contexts. That is, they are more abstract. It is a matter of controversy as to whether this is true of all languages. See Fraging Year 1996 for some counter-evidence. Thus, not only are definite expressions often developed from deictic expression, but anaphoric expressions are often developed from deictic expressions, and proper nouns sometimes develop into common nouns. Hence, eponymic nouns such as Wellingtons, cardigan, sandwich, sadism, and atlas, this movement is consistent with what has, in historical linguistics, been referred to as grammaticalization. As a lexical construction enters and continues along a grammaticalization pathway, it undergoes successive changes in meaning, broadly interpretable as representing an indirectional movement away from its original or concrete reference and toward increasingly general and abstract reference. Pagliuca, 1994. Pagliuca's statement makes the connection with the movement away from meanings and anchor in a concrete context towards the abstract. Reflection marking definiteness. Many European languages are like English in having a separate word or words, making definiteness. Other languages such as the Scandinavian language Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic, and the Semitic languages Hebrew, Arabic, and Kurdish use an affix rather than a separate word. Yet, other languages such as Latvian, Xhosa, and Indonesian regularly deploy a demonstrative, example, this, that, for this purpose. English can also use a demonstrative to signal definiteness. Try substituting this or that for the an sentence. 2.3a above. But it is not regularly deployed just to mark definiteness, in the way that the is. Still, other languages such as Chinese, Japanese, and Russian, and many other Slavic languages use none of these resources to mark definiteness. This is why, of course, a distinctive feature of English spoken by speakers of these languages. is the lack of definite article. Consider this sentence written by a Japanese pragmatic student. It is a principle of conversation. Indeed, some research on marking definiteness in English in interactions where all the participants are non-native speakers has suggested that dropping the definite article in some instances where it would be required in standard forms of English, and inserting it where it would not normally be grammatical required, is a feature of English as a lingua franca. See, for instance, Sid Hoofer 2001. It is not the case that any one form, such as the example of definite expression in Table 2.1, will always have a referring function, which incidentally is partly why these are pragmatic, not semantic issues. Consider this sentence. 2.5. Bus and train are much the same price at the moment, though it's quicker to take the bus. B and C, popular lore, periodical outdoor action. This is not likely to be referring to a particular bus, but to any vehicle with the attributes of a bus. It is a non-referential descriptive usage of a definite expression, as opposed to a referential usage. This distinction was labeled attributive versus referential by Donnellan 1966. Here, we are talking about buses as opposed to any other mode of transport. The definite expression invites the interpreter to work out the more general category, transport, of which this is a specific subcategory, buses. So, in this case, the definite expression is not used to signal an act of identification, but a distinction between the specific and the general. Additionally, we might note here the indefinite expression can also refer. Consider this sentence. 2.6. Suddenly, a small single-decker bus appeared at a corner not far away. B and C, ADM 884. Non-academic social science, the book Jaunting Through Ireland. Clearly, we are referring to a particular identifiable bus in a particular context, despite the fact that an indefinite article is used. Compare this with a non-referring usage of an indefinite expression, such as 2.7, too shy to board a bus. As a solitary student in London, he walked miles around the streets, sharpening his observations. B and C, A8F 665 newspaper The Guardian. In section 2.5, we will examine the function of referring expressions, including definite expression, more closely. We use proper nouns to invite hearer to identify the unique individual or set of individuals. We are talking about proper nouns. Inherently identify a unique individual or set of individuals. They have definiteness built in and thus appear as a subcategory of definite expression in Table 2.1. This fact may partly explain why, in English, one would not normally put a definite article before a proper noun. The Jonathan or the Michael sound decidedly odd, except in limited contexts such as that's not the Jonathan I was talking about. See also the reflection box below. However, this is not a full explanation because some other languages do allow a definite article before a proper noun. For example, in some dialects of Italian, definite article are systematically used before personal names. Example, La Maria. And in Italian generi, they are used before names of countries. Example, La Germania. This is not as bizarre as it may seem to the native English speaker. A century ago, Russell, 1910-1911, argued that proper nouns are not just empty shells, used to refer to a particular individual, but are associated with the descriptive content which determines what they refer to. Someone like definite common noun phrase such as the book. Reflection, proper nouns and meaning. Whether one agrees that proper nouns work through associated descriptive content or not, and this indeed controversial. There is no doubt that proper nouns are not the purest of referring expressions. They are not devoid of all abstract semantic meaning. They have rich connotations, with the line between connotative and denotative sense being fuzzy. Kassoff 1993-140 having reviewed a vast quantity of research, most of it in North American, and conducted studies of his own, concludes that both first names and surnames differ in attractiveness and connote impressions of the name's bearer age, intellectual competence, race, ethnicity, social class, and other attributes. It is not difficult to understand how these different associations have developed at different times. Different names have been fashionable and different social groups have preferred particular names. For example, the names Kevin and Tracy, though popular in the mid-80s, have experienced rapid decline. See figures in Dunkling 1995. Presumably because they became strongly associated with the young moneyed working class people of late Thatcherite Britain. While some scholars, Kripke 1972, may argue with some reason against the descriptive content view, saying that proper nouns directly refer without any mediating semantic content. A proper nouns clearly do have connotation that assist not only in the assignment of reference in context but also in the overall interpretations. For example, a tutor writing to summon an exclusive student may sign the communication, Jonathan Culpepper, as opposed to Jonathan, in order to crank up the level for formality and thus strengthen the request order. The general and important point here that each proper noun has its own semantic coloring which feeds into interpretative processes in interactions, is true of all referring expressions. Also, it is important to note that no one proper noun form is necessarily performing a referring function all the time. For example, Mick may be thought of as a proper noun, a popular short form of Michael, but it is a common noun in this sentence. When he first came in, I offered him a drink out of courtesy, and I think he thought I was talking Mike out of his drink in the past. BNC ATI 1224, part of biography. Indeed, proper nouns evolving into common nouns, so-called eponyms, is a regular method of word formation. 2.3 Deixis. We now turn to deixis, the category at the bottom of Table 2.1. We will discuss anaphora in the section following this one. Deixis relies heavily, though not completely, on the extralinguistic context to supply the referent, and not semantic elements within the deictic expression itself. It may be helpful to note here that the word deictic is borrowed from the Greek sektik, deiktikos, meaning able to show, showing directly. Deixis involve connections between a reference point and aspect of the situation in which the utterance takes place. Deictic expression invite participant to work out a particular connections. When somebody telephones another and say it's mine, they invite the interlocutor to work out, on the basis of oral characteristics, that me refers to the speaker. Occasionally, of course, the speaker's assumptions that the interlocutor can work out who is speaking turn out to be wrong, and the interlocutor has to ask explicitly who is something which is potentially embarrassing, because the speaker assumed that you were sufficiently familiar with them to identify them. Consider another example, this time provided by Charles Fillmore, 1997-60. The worst possible case I can imagine for a totally unanchored occasion sentence is that of finding afloat in the ocean a bottle containing a note which reads, "Meet me here at the noon tomorrow with a stick about this big." Who is me? Where is here? When is tomorrow? And how big is this? Example such as this neatly illustrate how one's understanding depends on making connection between a reference point, that is, a deictic center or anchorage point from which the speaker position their discourse in a particular context. If we cannot make this connection, we end up with very limited understanding. The deictic center is generally the "I here now" of the speaker, or more accurately of the speaking voice in the particular situation. The speaking voice could be that of, for example, an individual, a group of people, or a character in a book. Deictic expressions signal a perspective relative to a particular deictic center. Your, you is my, I.
your, here is my, there, etc. In conversation, the deictic center obviously flips back and forth according to who is speaking. The deictic center can also be projected. If somebody rings you up and invites you over for some coffee, you may reply, "I'll come over in a few minutes." Come is a deictic verb, as it suggests that movement of something in the context towards the deictic center. In this case, the deictic center is not that of the speaker but that of the addresses. This is a case of deictic projection. The speaker projects the deictic center onto the address and speaks from the point of view of the addressee. A key point about deictic expression is that they interface with grammatical system. This feature is brought out in Levinson's 1983-54 definition of deixis. Deixis concerns the way in which languages encode or grammaticalize feature of the context of utterance or speech event, and thus also concerns ways in which the interpretation of utterance depends on the analysis of the context of utterance. Expressions such as I, me, and my are most clearly part of grammatical systems. We shall see in a moment how the context of utterance has not always been grammaticalized in the same way in earlier periods of English. Table 2.2 displays the types of deixis traditionally identified and their associated expressions. Of course, deictic expression can be used non-deictically. Consider underlying items in these sentences. 2.9. Read the small print. You never know what you may find. BNC CTX 1117 Popular Lore, the magazine What Personal Computer. Now there is another way of advertising, and with Harrogate not coming off, I must say I'm quite keen on this. BNC J950-250 Public Speech Charity Committee Meeting. Expressions such as I, me, and my are most clearly part of grammatical systems. Sentence use a few lines above. Here, you is a generic usage not referring to anyone in particular. It is similar to one never knows. There does not pick out a particular location, but is a case of existential there. That is to say, kind of dummy subject which occurs in clauses about existence or occurrence of something. Finally, I, me, and my do not refer to the speaker, as they are metalinguistic mentions of the pronoun rather than uses of them. As Fillmore 1997 points out, even demonstrative, a category that seems to be the purest category of deictic items, in fact, have both deictic and non-deictic usages. Gestural usage such as this foot are supported. Table 2.2 Deixis types and English expressions. Deixis types. Example of English deictic expressions. Personal, a participant, I, you, we, etc. B. Social relationship. Joff, Mr. Leach, Professor Leach, Sir, Madam, Your Grace, etc. Spatial, this, that, here, there, come, go, opposite, away, etc. Temporal, now, then, today, next week, tense, recently, soon, etc. Discourse, that module, this means that, in the next module, etc. By a gesture like pointing, they are deictic. Symbolic usages, in contrast, rely on general spatio-temporal knowledge. They could be accompanied by gesture but would still be understood without. For example, in this newspaper, headline technology, let's make this country the best. The Guardian, 1/9/13, it will be obvious to most UK-based Guardian readers that this country refers to the UK, without gestures. The converse is also true. Typically, non-deictic expressions can be used deictically. For example, he or she would not normally be discussed as deictic expression, as they are typically anaphoric, referring back to something mentioned previously in the discourse rather than a connecting with the extralinguistic context. We will discuss anaphora in the following section, but it is not too difficult to imagine a context in which they clearly have a deictic referring function. Consider a reconstructed conversation during which a parent brings a crying baby into the room and an interlocutor
says. 2.10 So he's the one making all the noise. We should also keep in mind the fact that items within categories such as those of Table 2.1 vary with respect to the degree to which they are semantically descriptive and contextually pragmatic. For example, here indicates the speaker's spatial deictic center, but com also encodes the meaning of locomotion towards it. Let us elaborate on the particular categories of Table 2.2. Personal, as a deictic category, refers to the identification of three discourse roles in the speaking situation: the speaker, the first person, the hearer, the second person, and the party being talked about, the third person. Person is usually important grammatical category. First, second, and or third person is marked or implicit in all utterance. An indication of its importance in English is in the fact that the second most frequent word in spoken English is I and the third is you. Leach et al. 2001, 144. As we noted earlier, the most frequent is the. Personal deixis invites participants to identify the relevant discourse roles in. The context person markers are not devoid of encoded meaning. In fact, they rarely encode person alone, but also have other grammatical distinction. In English, these are numbers I versus we, gender he versus she, and case she versus her. Note here that deictic person markers are typically the first and second person, not the third. Third person forms are generally anaphoric, that is, not extra-linguistic but referring back to the linguistic context of the utterance. Though, as illustrated in the previous paragraph, third-person forms can be used deictically. Reflection, person markers in the history of English. English used to have a somewhat different system of grammaticalized expression available for deictic purposes. Regarding personal pronouns, one notable difference concerted number. While today, we can use most personal pronouns to distinguish number insofar as the referent is singular or plural. I versus we. In Old English, there were also the remnants of the dual forms of the first and second person pronouns. Thus, wit meant we both, and yit meant you both. This, of course, would also have implication for what at the time counted as plural in this grammatical system. It would have been more than two, whereas today it is more than one. However, the area of radical change concerned the second person pronouns. Elizabethan English, for example, offered a choice between two sets of pronominal forms of the second person: the forms ye, you, your, yours, and yourself, the you forms, and the forms from thou, thee, thy, tin, and thyself, the thou forms. In Old English, you generally use the first set of plural referent and the second for a singular. But by Middle English, the variant chosen could have significant social implications. These items had taken on a stronger social deictic role, rather than just personal. The usage of these sets is a matter of great controversy. Brown and Hillman 1960 predicted that high status social equal use you forms to each other, low status social equal use thou forms to each other. High status individual use thou forms to lower status, and low status individual use you forms to higher status. This prediction fit the usage of Middle English reasonably well. One can see a certain similarity in the way you forms and thou forms were used in this period of English, with the way, for example, tu and was are used in today's French, or du and sie in German. However, this prediction became more and more unreliable as we move towards the 17th century. The meanings of any particular usage had increasingly to be inferred from the specifics of context. Take this brief extract from the Merry Tales of Skelton 1567 as an example. In this tale, Skelton, a parson, tries to persuade a cobbler to go to war. 2.11 Neighbor,
You be a tall man and in the cage whereas you must be a standard. Generally, in this tale, Skelton uses thou to the cobbler that fits the theory which predicts a high-status participant using thou to a lower-status participant. But here, despite the differences in social status, Skelton uses you to the cobbler. Why he does so is a pragmatic issue, not simply a matter of correlating usage and status. Here, Skelton is trying to be persuasive using lends a note of respect. Ultimately, the thou forms have become obsolete except in some areas of Yorkshire and Lancashire, and some religious contexts. The fact that English second-person pronouns have now been reduced to a single set of forms, based on you, without any encoded meanings regarding number or social position, marks English out as distinct from any languages, especially European. By way of postscript, it is worth noting that some dialects of English have relatively recently developed the plural form. Use Liverpool English is a case in point, and this expression has been identified as characteristic of at least some Australian and Irish speaker of English. Horvath, 1985. In some dialects of American English, particularly in the South and Texan region of the U.S., other second-person plural forms such y-ill, you all, and yins, you once, can be found. In Table 2.2, we have split personal deixis in two subcategories, one pertaining to participant marking and the other pertaining to social relationship marking. The latter subcategory is often referred to as social deixis. There is absolutely no hard and fast distinction between these two subcategories. See Marmaridou 2079, The History of You Forms and Thou Forms in English is a case in point. Today, English relies largely on vocatives, expression usually used to address people, to mark social relationship, especially in the form of noun phrases, usually comprised of proper nouns and/or titles. Note, of course, the overlap here with the discussion of proper nouns in section 2.3. However, remember that we are focusing on deictic uses of proper nouns. Compare the deictic "Joff, come here" with the non-deictic "Joff came here." A summary of social deictic expression in present-day British English with very brief indication regarding context of usage and the proportion of uses accounted for by each type, expressed as a percentage, is as follow from Leach 1999, 109, 113, and Bieber et al. 1999. Endearments like darling, love, sweetie, typical address between close female family members, sexual partners, and favorite people, 5%.
Family kinship terms: mommy, daddy, ma, pa, grandma, granny, grandpa, granddad. Typical address to family members of an older generation, 10%. Familiarizers: guys, mate, folks, bro. Typical address between male signaling solidarity, 15%. First names: typical address between friends and family members as well as other, even casual acquaintances, 35%. A subgroup of first name is familiarized first name, shortened first name, and/or with the pet suffix "y-ie", like Marge, Tom, Jackie, 30%. Title and surname: Miss Jones, Mr. Graham, Miss Morrissey. Typical means of marking a more distant and respectful relationship, below 2.5%. Honorifics like sir, madam, ma'am, relatively rare in English. They may occur in situations such as formal service encounters where there is a markedly asymmetrical relationship between speaker, below 2.5%. Other C, below 5%. Although relatively rare, there is a wide range of other forms limited only by one's creativity. Bieber et al. 1999, 1109, 1110 provide some illustration from Longman Corpus of English. 2.12 Hello lazy. Oh, make your bloody mind up, boy. Come on your reds, come on your reds, come on your reds. Those of you who want to bring your pets along, please sit in the back of the spaceship. As might have been observed from the above summary, social deictic expression mark not only social relationship but also, amongst other factor settings, and in particular their degree of formality. A good example of social deixis restricted to a particular setting is the use of surnames only in more traditional schools. Notably, British public school not just by teacher to pupils but also to an extent between pupils themselves. Reflection. Social deixis across languages. Person marking varies hugely from language to language. Consider for example that Fijian is said to have 135 person forms, whereas Madurese, an Austronesian language, has only 2. Siwerka 2004-2, one of the reasons for this is that person marking interacts with the socio-cultural context of the particular language. As Ma Hasler and Har, 1990, 207 quoted in Siwerka 2004-214 comment, pronominal grammar provides a window to the relationship between themselves and the outside world. Obviously, this fact is most salient with respect to social deixis. Non-singular second-person marking when addressing a single person is often a way of signaling. Social distance deference, particularly in the context of an age differential, or formality, as was the case at least to some extent with the U forms in the earlier periods of English, and is still the case in many European languages, like French, German, Spanish, Greek, Danish, Swedish, Russian, Czech. Non-singular person marking is also used for single referent in many other languages, but not necessarily for the same social reason. Some languages achieve such social function with the use of the third person. For example, in Italian, one uses the third person feminine singular li, and in German, the third person plural sie. Such person marking phenomena are part of linguistic honorifics. Conventional system of forms that honor, like express deference to, a participant usually, but not necessarily the addressee. In some way, such forms include not only person markings but also forms for address. Various suffixes, clitics, and particles and choice of vocabulary. Present-day English does not have a rich honorific system, being now largely confined to forms of address, as noted above. Other languages, particularly those of East and Southeast Asia, like Thai, Japanese, Nepali, Korean, have remarkably rich systems. In Thai, there are said to be 27 forms used for the first person, 22 for the second, and 8 for the third. These are used according to, amongst other things, social status, intimacy, age, sex, and kinship, and to reflect deference or assertiveness. See Cook 1968 quoted in Siwerka 2004-228. Person markers, as we have seen for all referring expression in this module, are not always used in such a way that their encoded meaning matches their usage. Mismatches are often deployed for the purpose of generating local social meanings. Consider for example the range of possible reference for the English form we base on the list given in Siwerka 2004-15. 2.13. We equal I are not interested in the possibility of defeat Queen Victoria on the Boer War 1899. B. We, not I but you, want to eat our equal your dins now. Career talking to patient. C. We, she or he had wet panties again in playground. Mother talking about her child. D. We, I individually, and I individually, etc. solemnly swear. E. Shall we, I or you, book for just the two of us, me and you, then. F. We, I and he, will join you the moment John arrives. G. We, I and they, are underpaid and overworked. H. We, you, and you, etc. addresses we'll hear in this presentation. Some of these mismatches have become well established. A is of course the royal we, pragmatically I. A more recent example of which are the words of Margaret Thatcher upon discovering that she had become a grandmother. In 1989, we have become a grandmother. The royal we might be said to be a case of self-deference. The speaker is the honorific focus. Be is a typical usage of the exclusive we, pragmatically not I, where the avoidance of the pronoun you in requests or commands lends a venture of politeness. See Wales 1996 for a full discussion of we and other English pronouns. As can be seen from Table 2.2, a category of deictic expression can express spatial relations. As far as English is concerned, spatial deixis typically expresses a relationship relating to distance between the deictic center of the speaker and the referent. English has a proximal distal, as in near far contrast, as might be illustrated by items such as here, there, and this, that. However, usage of these items, particularly the final set of demonstrative, is not always restricted to physical spatial relations. In the extract from the Shakespeare below, John and Gaunt laments the fact that England is not what it was. England has been sold out by Richard II, the current king, in pursuit of his own glory. The contrast is between proximal, this England near in time, and distal, that England further away in time. 2.14 This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of man, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serve you in the office of wall, or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this real me, this England, is now leased out, I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm, England bound in with the triumph sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky bloats and rotten parchment bonds, that England that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Richard II, Act 2, Scene, First Folio, 1623. We might also briefly note that sometimes the issue is one of focusing the target attention. Thus, while here in "here she is" might well convey the fact that somebody has arrived in the vicinity, it also draws attention to that fact, and that in "I'd like the one" said of several items all the same distance from the speaker focuses the target attention on one particular item. Reflection, spatial deixis, and comparison with today's English. Today English deictic spatial expression are part of two-term system. However, English used to have a three-term system in addition to the adverbs here and there. English had the expression yonder, and in addition to the demonstratives this and that, it had the expression yon. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer write around 1386, "Who is that fair child that studded yonder, man of low tales?" These items were used for entity at some distance from the deictic center but still within sight. They are kind of medial stage between proximal and distal. Modern Spanish is an example of a language with a three-term system, STS and AQUEL, based on similar lines. Other languages differ from English with respect to the number of terms used and the kind of relationship captured. Modern German is a case in point, while modern spoken German has an adverb contrast, with hire here and don't there. It does not have a demonstrative contrast of the type achieved in English by this and that. Demonstrative occurring with nouns are comprised of thesers and stress there, die, thus. The unstressed latter items are usually considered definite articles. However, as Diesel 2008 points out, what makes all these items demonstrative like rather than definite article like is their pragmatic function. Like distance mark demonstrative, these expressions are commonly used to focus the hearer attention on entities in the surrounding situation, which is not what speakers usually do with definite markers. Readers will note some similarly here with the Old English. As discussed above, some languages mark even more degree of distance. Malagasy apparently uses 7 demonstrative adverbs and 6 demonstrative pronouns to mark increasing decrease of distance from the speaker. Anderson and Keenan, 1985, 292-294. English has spatial deictic system based on degrees of distance between the speaker as deictic center and referent. Some languages have different kind of relationship as their basis, one that is less egocentric and not based on degrees of distance. Japanese is an example of the language that factors in nearest or not of the referent to the speaker, the hearer, and the speaker and hearer. Thus, it has kono, near the speaker, sono, near the hearer, and ano, away from the speaker and the hearer. Kuno 1973-27 cited in Diesel 2008, if one remember the notion of deictic projection as introduced above, one can see how this might work. For example, with sono the speaker project the deictic center onto the hearer. Such deictic systems have been described as person-based system as opposed to distant-based system. Anderson and Kina 1985. Finally, we briefly note here that some Austronesian language do not take any speech participant as deictic center but orientate towards absolute geographical location points, such as seaward versus landward or even simply coordinates like north, south, east, and west. The final category in Table 2.2, temporal deixis, concern expression which can convey relation over time. As far as English is concerned, they typically express a relation between deictic center and the time of the speaker utterance. Now refers to a span of time encompassing the speaker utterance. The use of the present tense as opposed to past can mark the speaker current time of speaking. And auxiliary verbs such as will, shall, going to, etc. can mark some point in the future. Tomorrow, next week, yesterday, ago, etc. indicate a span of time in relation to the speaker current utterance. Deictic expressions, as we have seen, are usually taken as referring to entities in the extralinguistic world. Some scholars have also distinguished discourse or textual deixis, which involves making a connection with a segment of discourse. Consider this reconstructed word said by a tutor at the end of a lecture in the UK. 2.15. That's the end, but don't rush off just yet. As I said at the beginning, I have some announcement. Here they are. Then display and reads announcement on PowerPoint slide. That points back to the preceding discourse, the lecture. Here points to upcoming discourse. Given that we are now dealing with textual links, this category of deixis is not so pure. It also overlaps with the notion of anaphora, which we will discuss in the following section, though it is principally distinguishable on some counts as we will note. 2.4 Anaphora. Anaphoric expression refer to a previously expressed textual unit or meaning. The so-called antecedent. Anaphora in the context of linguistics is generally understood to refer to a relation between two linguistic elements wherein the interpretation of one, called an anaphor, is in some way determined by the interpretation of the other, called an antecedent. Wang 2000. It may be helpful to know that the term anaphora is derived from the Greek word ovapopa, meaning carrying back. Here is an example. 2.16. A. Should Michael peel the potatoes on the board? B. Yes, he can do them here. The anaphoric expression in this utterance and their antecedents are as follow. He, Michael, do peel them, the potatoes, and there on the board. The fact that both the anaphoric expression and their antecedent refer to the same entities they are co-referential is characteristic of many anaphora, but not of deixis. This is not to say that there is no overlap with deixis. Readers will have noted that the form there is also used a deictic expression. Indeed, in this utterance, one could imagine a scenario in which there is used not only to refer back to on the board but to pick out deictically the particular board to be used. The speaker could simultaneously point expression functioning anaphorically comprise most frequent third-person pronouns he, and repeated or synonymous noun phrases. B in the above example could have repeated the potatoes, but also, for example, other definite noun phrases including pronouns demonstrative such as those, proper nouns, proforms, do, and adverbs there. To this list, we might add the absence of an expression where it expected. A gap in the syntax. A typical example is the absence of the second finite verb in coordinated structure such as she took kindly to him and he took kindly to her. B and C, G0M 1282, Prose Fiction, the novel The Holy Thief. Needless to say, the resources available for expressing Anaphoric referents vary from language to language. For example, some languages, Salt U, a Papuan language, lack third-person pronouns deploying full nominal expression. Instead, see Werka 2004-6 who cites Irwin 1974. As one might guess, even typical anaphoric expressions are not always anaphoric and do not always refer, at least not straightforwardly. Consider this example of which concern the third-person singular pronouns. 2.17 A. It's not looking good, said, looking at the dark clouds in the sky. B. What times is it? An off-the-cuff remark. C. I think it's wonderful to strive to be made in medicine. BNC of LG 101 TV discussion. D. Kill it, cook it, eat it. The title of BBC documentary on the source of food. It in A has no textual antecedent. It is not anaphoric but most obviously a deictic usage. It points to the particular state of the sky. Halliday and Hassan 1976-1997 label uses that rely on something outside the text for their interpretation esophoric, a category which contrasts with endophoric, which include uses that rely on something inside the text. It in B is similar to A. It has textual antecedent. However, although it also involves the extralinguistic context and thus is exophoric, it is not picking out something specific in the situational context in which it is said, as will be the case with deixis. Instead, it is an empty or dummy subject referring to an aspect of the context of the utterance that can readily be inferred. Dummy subjects or objects such as these are often used to refer to very generic contextual aspect of utterance, notably relating to time, distance, how far is it to Lancaster, or whether it's nice and warm. Bieber et al. 1999, 332, Halliday and Hassan 1997 label such uses homophoric. It in C is similar to an anaphoric usage, but in this case, it is referring forward to textual segment that strive are to be made in medicine. By the unusual noun strive, the speaker presumably means the things that can be successfully striven for. Such uses are termed cataphoric. Halliday and Hassan 1997. Finally, the point of interest regarding D is that each instant of its co-referential, that is, each refers to the same entity, except that they do not quiet the animal that is killed. It's not identical to the animal that is cooked and is eventually eaten. But of course, the point of this title is to make it clear that we are anesthetized to the realities of eating meat by the fact that we only encounter it as prepared food in supermarkets. Reflection. Anaphoric and other referring expression, their variation across English written register. Bieber et al. 1998, Module 5, explore the usage of referring expression, particularly anaphoric expression, across different register using the corpus-based methodology. See also Bieber et al. 1999, 237-240 for similar findings. More specifically, they examine referring expression, noun phrases, and pronouns across two spoken register, conversation, and public speeches. Though we will not report the result of public speeches here, from the London Land Corpus and two written register news, reportage, and academic prose. From the LOB corpus, they found an even distribution of referring expression, new reportage and the large number 63 per 200 words, then conversation 61, and finally academic prose 51. To understand this difference better, Bieber et al. Then look at the distribution according to type of referring expression. Retrieving frequencies across the register for exophoric pronouns, anaphoric pronouns, and aphoric pronouns. They discovered that esophoric referring expression made up over half of the referring expression in conversation, whereas they were almost non-existent in the written register news and academic prose. Those written register were dominated by anaphoric nouns. In other words, people not surprisingly regularly refer to aspects of their immediate extralinguistic context in conversation, whereas in the written register, they refer to aspects of the previous text. They also look at the average distance between the referring expression and the antecedent in the various register. This distance was defined as the number of intervening noun phrases. Some large difference emerged. The average are Conversation 4.5, Academic Prose 9.0, and the News Reportage 11.0. That referring expression occur much closer to their antecedent in conversation can be partly explained by the fact that conversation is conducted online with all the mental processing pressure that implies. Referring expression with short distances to their antecedent are easier to understand, but this finding is also a consequence of the referring expression type. Esophoric referring expression do not have an intervening textual material, they refer directly to their references. 2.5 Using and understanding referring expression in interaction. 2.5.1 Referring expression and context. The following is the beginning of Ken Kesey novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1962-2003 1. 2.18 They're Out There. This is a creative way to begin a novel. It creates psychological prominence. We have the outline of a puzzle here, but not the pieces with which to complete it. We know that some group of people there are located some space away from where the speaker writer is out there. The referring expression begins to build the point of view of one particular character, the protagonist who is incarcerated in mental institution. It flags the kind of context that needs fleshing out. This helps achieve the dramatic purpose of the novelist. Let us look at another literary example. This is the first stanza of W. H. Auden poem Funeral Blues, Stop All the Clocks, 1936-1976. 2.19 Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone. Prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the morns come. As we pointed out in section 2.2, definite noun phrases presuppose the existence of their reference and can be used to invite the participant to identify a particular referent from a specific context, which is assumed to be shared. Thus, the definite noun phrase in the book you're reading is great. Example 2.3, A may be taken as identifying the book the speaker says you're reading rather than say the one you read when you go to bed, because you both share. Through physical co-presence, visual contact, the specific context. However, the definite noun phrase in the Auden poem are not like this. They presuppose the existence of clocks, telephone, dog, pianos, coffin, and mourners. But in doing this, they also construct the context in which the particular reference can be identified. They do not passively rely on a specific shared context for interpretation, rather they construct a specific shared context in which they can be interpreted. These items construct a particular fictional world. More particularly, the items coffins, mourners in the final line trigger the contextual frame or schema of funeral by virtue of the fact that they are stereotypical components of that contextual frame. See section 3.2.1 for discussion of schemata and background knowledge in general. Thus, they suggest the frame in which they can be identified as particular components as opposed to simply being identified as particular components within a given frame. It is not surprising the literary linguistics scholars have focused on how referring expression in literature contribute to the creation of fictional worlds. Semino, 1997, in fact, it is normal in all kinds of interaction for people to rely on information from context to interpret referring expression and also to use referring expression to help construct the context in which they are interpreted. It is a two-way street. Note that it is a radical departure from the traditional approach to referring expression, which focuses on the context fleshing out the referring expression and not referring expression signaling the context of which it is part. An excellent example of the latter cited by Espin, 1999-58, appears in newspaper. In this example, a sport commentary writer reflects on the city of Los Angeles' loss of two professional football teams who used to play there. 2.20 So we lose the rumps and the riders lost our innocence but hold the flowers, put away the handkerchief, stop the sobbing, we still have the Rose Bowl, haven't we? Original emphasis. Like the poem above and probably partly inspired by it, the definite noun phrase, the flowers, the handkerchief, and the sobbing refers to stereotypical components of the frame of the funeral. The funeral frame itself it is mentioned prior to usage of these definite noun phrases. As Epstein, 1999-58, comments, the frame itself need to be directly evoked at all but can be activated simply by mentioning some of its silent elements.
In section 2.2, we wrote that definite expressions are primarily used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific context which is assumed to be shared by the interlocutors. The use of primarily was judicious because the uses of referring expression discussed in this section, creating psychological prominence, expressing viewpoint, or triggering frames do not fit well the idea of identifying particular reference from items in a given category. Epstein, 1999, suggests that thinking in terms of accessibility is preferable, and we will expand on this notion in the following section. 2.5.2 Referring Expression and Accessibility. Prince 1981 and Ariel 1988-1990 proposed that different types of referring expression are used by producer according to their assumptions about how accessible the referent is in the mind of the target. Ariel 1988 proposed an accessibility marking scale along with referring expression are ranked according to degrees of accessibility. Thus, at one end produce use zero gaps pronouns and demonstrative pronouns for highly accessible reference, while at the other end they use long definite expression and full names to refer to less accessible reference. For example, in saying, "Have you got it with you?" the producer assumed that he referent of it's highly accessible to the target. One does not have to spell it out. In contrast, in saying, "Have you got your classic car with you?" the producer assumed that the referent is less accessible to the target, and so the fuller your classic car is required. The accessibility of referent is said to be determined by four factors: the saliency of the referent, the recency of previous mention, the number of other referents competing for the role of antecedent, and the degree of cohesion between the units that the expression and its antecedent occur in. Gondel et al.'s 1993 givenness hierarchy ranks referring expression along a scale according to the assumed cognitive status of the associated referents for the target. Cognitive status refers to the assumed attention state of the referent, something in focus right now, something in memory, but not currently active, something completely unknown. However, unlike the accessibility marking scale, the thrust of the giveness hierarchy is the particular referring expression provide information to the target addressee about where in memory or not in memory at all. The representation of the referent is expected to be found. For example, using the pronoun it indeed, any unstressed third-person pronoun, to refer to a classic car signal to the target that they do not need to search widely for the referent classic car, but that it is in focus, as in currently activated in short-term memory and the center of attention. It is the immediate topic on conversation. In contrast, a classic car signal merely that the target knows the category classic car, described by the expression. They can identify the type. Somewhere in between will be, for example, the expression that classic car, which signals that the target is familiar with the referent. They not only know the category but are able to identify the specific intended referent because they have representation of it in memory. Each type of referring expression is conventionally associated with particular cognitive status. Any use of that expression signals a particular cognitive status which the target can then take into account in their search for an interpretation. The cognitive statuses discussed in the work of Gondel and colleagues are as follows: high cognitive attention state, low cognitive attention state, activated, familiar, uniquely identifiable, referential, type identifiable. Figure 2.1 The cognitive statuses of referring expression, solid block arrows can be taken to mean and thus also entailing. A key point to note about these cognitive statuses is that they are not mutually exclusive. The statuses are related such that a particular cognitive status entails lower statuses. For example, an item that is in focus is necessarily activated, familiar, uniquely identifiable, and so on. The importance of this scale, Gondel and colleagues argue, is that it is a basis for implicational meanings via Gray's 1975 maxim of quantity, to be discussed in Module 4, whereby using form with the weaker status implicates that a stronger status does not obtain. Thus, saying a classic car implicates that the speaker believes that the addressee cannot uniquely identify the referent, whereas saying that classic car implicates, for instance, that the speaker believes that the referent is not in focus. activated in short-term memory and the center of current attention. Let us briefly illustrate some of this issue with the following joke. 2.21. Voice on the phone. Hello, is that the maternity hospital? Receptionist. Yes, voice on the phone. Can you send an ambulance round? The wife is about to have a baby. Receptionist. Is this her first baby? Voice on the phone. No, this is her husband. At the heart of the joke are the differing understanding arising from the demonstrative. This is the second utterance of the receptionist. Most likely for the receptions, and indeed the reader, the referent of this activate status as the baby was mentioned in the immediately previous sentences. Though it was not the topic, hence it was not in focus. In the receptionist's second utterance, her first baby is the topic and thus it is brought into focus. According to givenness hierarchy, we might have expected a husband to reply, no, it's not her first baby, or yes, it's her first baby. However, the husband constructs a radically different understanding, namely that this refers to the identity behind his voice. To sustain this, we must assume that he thinks that the receptionist thinks that this refers to the voice on the phone and that the voice is that of her first baby. In some bizarre world, the first baby is telephoning to us for an ambulance. In this scenario, this merely has the status of being referential, that is, referring to a particular voice but not one that is even uniquely identifiable. This, of course, is completely improbable because their respective identities have in fact been established. The social dexis of the wife implies that he is the husband. They at least have the cognitive status of activated. The givenness hierarchy usefully throws light on how the choice of referring expression works. It is not, however, a complete account of referring expression. It is based on the notion of givenness, understood assumptions about accessibility for the target. We elaborate more on givenness in the following module. However, in section 2.5.1, we saw pronouns used in context where the reference accessibility was not the only issue. It was not simply a matter of where to access something in one's mind. Epstein, 1999, whose work is focused on the definite article, that was very aware of this and hence defined accessibility simply as being available for interpretation. 1999-67, he concludes from his analysis of real data that the article seems to be an instruction which prompts the addressee into making the appropriate conceptual construction for interpreting the nominal discourse, ibid. In other words, such prompts go beyond helping identify where in the mind to access a referent. A prompt can introduce new reference and do so in such a way that facilitates interpretation of the discourse by, for example, creating psychological prominence, expressing a viewpoint, or triggering frames. 2.5.3 Referring expression and common ground. Again, recollect our statement that definite expressions are primarily used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific content which is assumed to be shared by the interlocutors. The idea of assumed to be shared is crucial in pragmatics. Note, for example, that the baby joke 2.21 is difficult to explain without reference to the notion of common ground, also broadly referred to as, for example, mutual or shared knowledge, assumption, or beliefs. Specifically in the joke, the idea of making assumption about people assumption arose. We must assume that he thinks that the receptionist think that this refers to the voice on the phone and that the voice is her first baby. Herbert Clark and his colleagues C. Clark 1996, Clark and Marshall 1981 have made important contribution to the understanding of common ground. To illustrate the issue, consider that the first author of this book is a closest petrolhead. Most of his colleagues in the world of academia would not know a connecting road from a crankshaft. Consequently, if a conversation shifts to cars, he makes the assumption that they do not both have this background knowledge. Conversely, it is more than likely, given that his interests are hidden, that they make the assumption that he also lacks knowledge in this area. And conversations are tailored accordingly. Cars are distinguished according to color and fuel consumption rather than whether their engines incorporate pushrods or overhead crankshafts. Note what is happening here. Assumptions are being made on both sides about what knowledge is common to both parties, that is about common ground. Importantly, one makes assumptions about what assumptions are being made about what knowledge is in common. He assumed that these colleagues assumed that they both know very little about cars. This is important because deciding what to say will, in part, depend on your assumption about what you think the others think you both know. One could make further assumption about those assumptions about the knowledge you have in common. He assumed that his colleagues assumed that he assumed that they both know very little about cars. And further level could be added, of course. This infinite recursion of assumption is not the stop of psychological reality. People would become mentally exhausted. Psycholinguistic research is not very precise about how many levels of assumption are deployed in communication. Some suggest we do not go beyond 3, others suggesting at most 6. See the research cited in Clark 1996 100 and Lee 2001 30. There is, in fact, another way of affording insight into this phenomenon, and that is by inspecting interacting themselves. People can check that assumptions about common ground are correct or repair understanding that appear to be based on erroneous assumption about common ground. See the following section and also section 3.4.2. Further discussion and illustration, recursion or reflexivity in pragmatics is topic to which we will return in section 8.2. Common ground can be seen as a subset of background knowledge, the subset that is relevant to communication, because it is believed to be in common amongst the participants involved. Note here that we are more accurately talking about background assumption and beliefs which are held with varying degrees of certainty rather than knowledge. On what basis might we suppose something to be common ground? One such basis concerns social cultural knowledge. We assume common information about the practice and convention of our culture and communities. Consider the shared information in academia, physical and natural laws, and experience involving others. Another basis concerns personal experience with other people. We assume common information about whether others are co-present at an event or not, the kind of relation among us, friends, strangers, more powerful, less powerful, particular events, and particular discourse. See Clark 1996 100-116 for an extensive elaboration of these bases. The fact that common ground involved amongst other things, shared knowledge of particular discourses is important in a number of respects. Everything that is said in the discourse potentially constitutes part of the common ground for those participants party the discourse, along with the other happenings that accompany that conversation, like the action of participant, visual appearance, sounds. Discourse, of course, is dynamic, and if it is amongst other experiences, feeding common ground, then common ground is dynamic too. Another issue to which we will return in the following section as well as in section 3.4.2. People tailor their referring expression according to assumption about common ground. Clark and Wilkes-Gibbs 1986, Wilkes-Gibbs and Clark 1992, a definite noun phrase, a deictic expression, or an aporic expression invites an interlocutor to interpret something in a particular way, often to pick out a particular referent in common ground. Whether or not your interlocutor will be able to do this is calculated gamble based primarily on one's understanding of the common ground that pertains. If you say, "Can you repeat that please?" you assume that your interlocutor will understand what your deictic that is referring to, like the specific portion of discourse that you have both shared. Or if you say, "Can you pass me that?" you assume that your interlocutor can understand your deictic that is referring to the pepper mill she has just been using in front of you. It goes without saying that what can never know anything for sure. Knowledge is simply what is assumed until it is disapproved, and that one can never truly share knowledge. We cannot copy the contents of our heads. Sperber and Wilson 1995 make much of this, saying that we should really be talking about knowledge as what can he potentially know, and about shared knowledge as what can be potentially shared about what is potentially known. See also Lee 2001. Reflection, recognition that exists, or tingami. A specific phenomenon that is strongly dependent on common ground concern nominal expressions such as tingami, tingamajig, tingimabob. Who jar was it? What is his name? What do you call it? And you know what? Such expression, unlike the definite noun phrase discussed earlier, provide little descriptive information to help one work out what is being talked about. Yet, in the shared context of a dinner, an expression such as tingami is likely to be taken as a reference to the pepper meal on the table, and was equally like to have been used in the expectation that this reference would be assigned. Recognitional dexis is a label coined by Enfield 2003 for such items. It acknowledges that they behave like deictic expression picking out items relative to the speaker here and now, but also that they rely heavily on common ground to be successfully recognized. Why might we use such word? Consider this example of recent usage of tingami taken from Oxford English Corpus. 2.22 Society. Anyway, back to the point, Mandela has little to do with this US versus Iraq. Tingami, and it means that he can speak out in a way that many of others can't. But he's terrible involved in the wool Zimbabwe tingami, and it means that he can speak about that. Weblog, I partook of the lamb shank and Ma had the beef tingami. Weblog, this is because some sort of technical tingami happened with our hosting tingami. Although you do not have access to the full context, it is quite easy to see that they are often used in contexts where specialized lexis will be required, like technical items or specialized cuisine, or where there may be difficulty in identifying an appropriate word, like dealing with the sensitive of diplomatic wrangle, or where there are restrictions on the obvious term, like labeling cleaning product without actually using the trademark name. In context, it is highly likely that this will present few difficulties because the participants have a common ground. Additional, it is not the case that such expression present participant with no descriptive information at all. In fact, they offer constraints on interpretations. This point is spelled out by Enfield 2003. He suggests, for example, that the speaker's message in using what his name could be defined as someone male. I can say this person name now by saying what his name. I think you'll know who I am thinking of 2003 105. This contrasts with, for example, you know what, which may have both avoidance and conspiratorial function, whereby a speaker deliberately avoids saying a certain word, either to prevent potentially overhearing third parties from understanding and or to create exclusive air between interlocutors. 2003 106. 2.5.4 Referring expression in interaction. Thus far in section 2.5, we have raised a number of issues that are key to interaction, including the idea that referring expressions are not simply enriched by context, but can also help construct it. The choice of referring expression as influenced by the speaker assumption about the degree to which the referent is in target mind, like its cognitive status. See also Isaacs and Clark 1987 for experimental evidence. And 3. The choices of referring expression in influenced by assumption about the common ground that pertains between specific interlocutors. See also Brennan and Clark 1996 for experimental evidence. All this go beyond our initial idea of inviting participants to pick some particular referent out of a specific content. This section briefly explored two further notions at the heart of interaction. One is that the process choosing and enriching referring expression is dynamic. It is worked out in the course of interaction, and the other is that the process is emergent. It is not predetermined by certain combination of referring expression and context. As we noted in the previous section, shared discourse plays a role in feeding common ground. Here we see the participant using discourse to establish common ground. Example 2.23. Illustrate how what is being referred to, the referent emerge in the interaction, and how the two interlocutors collaborate in working it out. 2.23 IV. I am told that she's going to live next door to the where she used to live, the doctor house. ER unless. PS 221 unclear. IV. That's pulled down, almost opposite that United Reformed Church. PS2 22J. Which house is that? Ivy. Well, they're you. I don't know what it's like now, but they you. PS 200 22J. It's not quite opposite, it is. Ivy. ER. PS 21J. It's more or less opposite where your father's shoe shop was. Ivy. Oh, is it? Oh. PS 22J. You mean the big red brick one next door to the doctor's surgery? Ivy. Yes, unclear. The doctor unclear just there. PS 221J. Yeah, that's it. I unclear J how J, BNC HDK 356 367 dialogue between two women. Leisure context. Clearly, Ivy wants to specify where the referent of she is going to live, but is having difficulty. Note that incomplete definite noun phrase next door to the, together they work it out through spatial they exist, next door twice opposite. 3 times mapping out the location through question and answer. The eureka moment comes with PS 221, hugely descriptive definite noun phrase, the big red brick one next door to the doctor's surgery, assisting Ivy in identifying the location, and when Ivy confirms the referent of this noun phrase, PS 221 switches to anaphoric it. A key scholar to have explored conversational interaction and referring expression, specifically anaphora, is Barbara Fox, 1987-1996. Fox, 1987-16, argued that there is a continuous interaction amongst the following 3 steps of reasoning. 1. Anaphoric form of X is the unmarked form for a context like the one the participant is in now. 2. By using anaphoric form X, then the participant displays a belief that the context is of a particular sort. 3. If the participant displays the belief that the context is of a particular sort, then the other parties may change their beliefs about the nature of the context to be in accord with the belief displayed. Just as we have been discussing above for Fox 1987-17, anaphoric choice at once is determined by and itself determines the structure of the talk. Also note that change is built in. As beliefs about context change, then what counts as unmarked changes for the selection of the next form. What this means, then, is that the usage of referring expression and what counts their reference in context is not only a two-way street, but a street whose direction is constantly shifting as it is mapped out by its traffic. Or to put it another way, the meanings of referring expression emerge in a dynamic fashion as the interaction progresses. Fox 1987-1819 suggests that the basic pattern in non-story conversation is the first mention of a referent in a sequence are done with a full noun phrase, and thereafter a pronoun is used to display an understanding that the sequence is not close. Conversely, using a full noun phrase displays an understanding that is close. However, what counts as a sequence varies from genre to genre, as we have seen in the reflection box on variation across English written register. The usage of referring expression varies hugely across genre, so what will count as unmarked will vary. Moreover, note that this is a basic pattern participant can exploit it. One context in which this can happen is disagreement. Note that final line of this example from Fox data, Fox 1987-62. R. Those Alex tanks, weren't they? V. Pond me. R. Didn't they belong to Alex? V. No, Alex has no tanks. Alex is trying to buy my tank.
Here the use of proper nouns Alex instead of the pronominal he is geared towards attracting the attention of the first speaker to the fact that her or his assumption about Alex are incorrect. Moreover, Downing 1996-136 observes that proper noun can be usefully deployed in contexts where the speaker wishes to display his or her authority to speak about a particular referent as it common to disagreement context, and this fits here. Reflection: the use of mate in interacting amongst Australian speaker of English. We earlier mentioned in passing that familiarizers such as mate are often used in British English as a means of signaling solidarity amongst males. However, recent work by Rendell Short 2009 indicates that among Australian speakers of English, at least younger females are now also using the term mate as an address term, rather than being seen as a term used primarily by men to show equality or egalitarianism. It is perceived as a friendly and fun term used to show intimacy. This indicates that the use of perception of sociolinguistic expression can change over time, or at least they can change across generation of speaker of English. Rendell Short 2010 also illustrate in a follow-up study how the sequential replacement of mate contributes to the understanding of participant about its function and implication in a particular context. It was found in her study that mate very often occurs after an assessment, agreement, acknowledgement, or appreciation in the following interaction. For instance, a father congratulates his son, a positive assessment followed by the address term mate. Son, oh dad. 0.2, I'm in. Father, oh well. Done, mate, well done. Son, oh it's cause of you, mate, you and the kids. Father, mate, you did this, good job. Adapted from Rendell Short 2010, 1206. The son appreciation in the following turn, it cause of you, is also followed by mate. It sets post position context. It is used to signal open friendliness. However, in rejecting the acknowledgement, the father subsequently uses mate in the middle of his turn rather than it being post position. In this case, the use of mate mitigates the force of this agreement. We can see then that the sequential positioning of referring expression can contribute at least in part to the interpretation of its particular function. We will return to consider the issue of sequentially and speech act in Module 6. 2.6 Conclusion. While it is clear that no referring expression is devoid of semantic meaning, he has the sense of something singular and usually male, the proform do of some kind of action, etc. Definite expression, deictic expression, and aphoric expression depend in large part of their full meaning on both the hearer working out the relevant reference, the speaker choosing referring expression to nudge the target understanding in the relevant direction, and both the speaker and the hearer collaborating in these processes. This is why they are both semantic, a pragmatic phenomenon. We should also remember that referring expression forms do not always refer. The second word for this paragraph, for example, is not referring. We need to work out when they do and when they do not. The converse is also the case. Sometimes, non-referring expression refer our final section 2.5. Focus on the uses and understanding of referring expression in interaction. We pointed out that referring expressions are not simply empty slots filled with contextual information. Those referring expressions can, and often do, trigger the relevant contextual information with which they are filled. They can be used for a range of functions, including the expression of psychological prominence or a particular viewpoint. We discussed how speakers select particular referring expression according to their assumption about the degree to which the referent is in the target mind's eye. In turn, hearer interpret those referring expression in part by taking into consideration what is implied by the speaker particular selection. We also introduced a common ground and its role in influencing the section of referring expression and retrieval of reference. Finally, we focus on the dynamic and emergent characteristic of referring interaction, including the exploitation of referring expression, for example by choosing less obvious referring expression to signal a particular interpersonal meaning, such as relative power. As far as English is concerned, we have shown how, especially in our reflection boxes, some features that are common to many Englishes, such as the definite article, do not appear in other languages. And even within English, English may have been different in the past. We have not only touched on contrast with other languages, but also variation amongst Englishes and within a particular English. We also consider variation within speech and in writing. Apart from the obvious conclusion that discussion of working of referring expression cannot be based on datasets consisting just of English referring expressions, we should note that the way in which those expressions vary is a particular source of interest in its own right.
whether it is accounting for changes from demonstrative to definite article in terms of grammaticalization. Differences amongst written genera or the role that referring expression undertake in creating their own interpretative frames. In fact, to fully understand the phenomena constituted by referring expression, we need to understand that variation.